This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Parsha Shemini. The end of the Parsha talks about the simanim of kosher animals, behemoths, chayos, oifos, and dagim and fish. And the Torah tells us in Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Tes, Azeh toichlu mikol asher b'mayim. You could eat the following from what's in the water. Kol asher loy snapir v'kaskesas. Anything that has snapir, our fins, v'kaskesas, our scales. Our scales. Now, how do you remember which one is which? It's very easy. The word snapir is basically fins backwards, you know. Samach nun pei is fins backwards. Kaskesas is scales backwards. But that's how I remember. Okay, so kol asher loy snapir v'kaskesas. Anything that has fins or scales. B'mayim, b'yamim, in the seas, uvanachalim, or the streams, oisam techila, that's what you could eat. Then Pasuk Yud seems to repeat the exact same thing. Pasuk Yud says, V'chol asher ein lo snapper v'kaskesas, something that does not have fins and scales, bayamim, in the seas of anachalim or the streams, mikol sheretz hamayim, from anything that swarms in the water, mikol nefesh achaya shebamayim, or any living creature in the water, sheketz heim lachem, it should be detestable to you. Now the first thing we have to look into is, why does the Torah repeat the exact same thing twice? The Torah in Pasuk Tes told us that the simanim, the signs of a kosher fish, are fins and scales. So why is it necessary for the Torah to reiterate itself again in Pasuk Yud and say, if it doesn't have fins and scales, it's not kosher? We said that in Pasuk Tes. And why is it in Pasuk Yud it adds, not just kol asher b'mayim, but it spells out sheretz hamayim, anything that swarms in the water, and it spells out nefesh achaya, any living thing. Okay, this is something we're going to try to look into. Okay. There's a Mishnah in Nida that basically goes out on a limb, goes out on the line, and puts its neck out, and gives us the following general principle. Even though, according to the Torah, for a fish to be kosher, it has to have fins and scales. So presumably, a fish possibly could have both fins and scales. It could possibly have neither. It could have fins but not scales, or it could have scales but not fins. Says the Mishnah Masechta Nida, it's also quoted in the Gemara in Chulin. Kol sheyesh loy kaskeses yesh loy snapir. Any fish that has scales has fins. Again, nobody asked the Mishnah to give us this piece of information. The Mishnah is really sticking its neck out. Because if it's giving us a rule that any fish that has scales automatically has fins, if we were to discover a fish that has scales but does not have fins, so we've really destroyed the credibility of the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah is giving us a general rule. Any fish that has scales automatically has fins, you know? So you go to the fish store, you come home with the fish that has scales and doesn't have fins, you've destroyed the credibility of the Torah Shabbat Peh, the oral law. And yet the Mishnah is not afraid. The Mishnah has no fears. The Mishnah states, again, in the time of the Mishnayos, there are probably thousands of species of fish that had not been discovered, and yet the Mishnah is able to make the statement, any fish that has scales will have fins. Okay, however, the Mishnah continues, it is possible for a fish to have fins, but no scales. So again, if the fish has scales, could you eat the fish? Yeah, you can eat the fish. Do you even have to check if it has fins? You don't even have to check. Because the Mishnah told us a rule. If a fish has scales, it will automatically have fins. You don't see it. You don't know where they are. It doesn't matter. It's automatic. It's a rule. Any fish that has scales. But it's possible for it to have fins, but no scales. Okay. What's the obvious question on this Mishnah? The obvious question is, the Marinus asks, that if it's an automatic rule that any fish that has scales automatically has fins, why would it be necessary for the Torah to tell us that, you know what kind of fish you're allowed to eat? A fish that has scales and fins. Why is there a need to say anything about fins? If it's an automatic rule that any fish that has scales automatically has fins, so let the Torah just say, any fish that has scales, you could eat it. It's not necessary for the Torah to say, any fish that has scales and fins you could eat, because there's a rule. Any fish that has scales will automatically have fins. So that's the question of the Gemara in Masechta Nida. It's also the question of the Gemara in Masechta Chulin. We left out the word velicht over here. Look at number 3. The Gemara asks, V'lichtoi v'rachmana kaskeses v'loi boi snapir. Let the Torah just write scales, and there's no need to write fins, right? There's a rule, there's a principle. Any fish, you buy the fish, you check if there's scales, and if there's scales, you know they're fins, so what's the need? There's no need for the Torah to add a siman. Any fish that has scales is kosher.
How Rabbi?
Kol asher loy kaskesas b'mayim oisam teichelu. Any fish that has scales you could eat. Well, what do you mean? But Hashem wanted it to have fins also. Yeah, it will have fins. Because any fish that has scale will automatically have fins. Answers the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Avo, V'chein tanid ve Rabbi Shmuel, Yagdil Torah v'yadir. Let the Torah be great and glorious. The answer of the Gemara is completely inexplicable. What does the Gemara mean? What do you mean, let the Torah be great and glorious? We have a kasha. We know there's not one extra word in the Torah. Every word in the Torah is accounted for. So if every word in the Torah is accounted for, why is it necessary for the Torah to write that for a fish to be kosher, it has to have fins? There's a rule. Any fish that has scales will automatically have fins. What do you mean, Yagdil Torah v'yadir? Let the Torah be made great. I mean, there are hundreds of Gemaras that ask, what do we need this pasuk for? What do we need that pasuk for? Well, this pasuk is extra, that pasuk is extra. So why don't we answer those questions? Yagdil Torah v'yadir, let's make the Torah bigger. If the stone Chumash would only have 3,000 pages, it wouldn't be big enough. We want it to have 3,001. And by the way, the answer of Yagdil Torah v'yadir is not found anywhere in the entire Shas. Nowhere in the entire Shas does the Gemara ever ask a question, Lama likra, what do we need this pasuk for? You know what the answer is? We wanted to make the Torah a little bit bigger. That's not an answer you'll find anywhere in Shas. And yet, when it comes to the simanim of kosher fish, where we have a rule that anything that has scales automatically has fins, the Gemara asks, why say anything about fins? What's the answer? Yagdil Torah v'yadir, let's make the Torah bigger, more glorious. Then, what kind of glory is it to the Torah to have extra words? What's the Gemara's answer? What does the Gemara mean? Okay, so that's the question we would like to investigate. Okay. Rabbi said, what would we do if somebody walked into the shul tonight, he went fishing, he brought into the shul a fish that had scales but no fins? What would we do?
It's kosher.
It's kosher.
It's kosher. The only problem is the Mishnah told us there's no such thing. But the Mishnah said any fish that had scales would automatically have fins. How would we deal with such a problem? Again, right? The Mishnah is telling us a scientific fact. And the fact is, any fish that has scales has fins. Mm-hmm. How would we deal? Let's say somebody walked in, he brought us a fish that had scales and didn't have fins, right? How do we deal with that? Would we say, maybe, chas v'shalom, did the Mishnah make a mistake? Or maybe, how do we deal with such an issue? Well, let's see. Actually,
he couldn't find the skins.
What?
He couldn't find them. They're there.
Okay, now scales you could say, maybe they fell off. But fins are like feet, right? Fins are like legs.
Right.
Fins ain't falling off, right? So what would happen? So you'd say, what do you mean what would happen? The Mishnah is telling us this cannot happen. This will never happen. And yet, we find the Madane Yom Tov. The Madane Yom Tov is the commentary of the Tosfos Yom Tov on the Rosh in Masechta Chulin. By the way, the Tosfos Yom Tov was born in 1579. In many shuls on Shabbos Mevarchim, right before the Mevarch Rosh Chodesh, they recite a tefillah from the Tosfos Yom Tov that Hashem should bless Komi Sheshoimer Piv Ulashoinoi Shaloi Ledaber B'Shas HaTefillah. The Tosfos Yom Tov felt that the tragedies that were occurring during his time, terrible pogroms, he attributed it to the sin of talking by davening, and because of that he composed a special tefillah to be recited, and it's recited in many shuls on Shabbos Mevarchim. This is written by the Tosfos Yom Tov, and of course the Tosfos Yom Tov wrote the classic commentary on the Mishnah. And the Tosfos Yom Tov writes that there was a period of time he was the Av Bezdin and the Ram in Vina, and a man walked into his office by the name of Rabbi Aaron Haroife. A doctor came into his office, and he presents him with a fish. And the name of the fish is, you can take a look in number 5 on the third line, Satincus Marinus. That was the nomenclature, perhaps, of the fish. Satincus Marinus, that's the nice way of pronouncing it, right? And this fish, its natural habitat was the Yam Hasfardi, the Mediterranean near Spain. And this fish was a poisonous fish. It was an inedible fish. You cannot eat this fish. You eat the fish, you drop dead. And pharmacists were able to extract the poison of the fish and use some of the parts of the fish for medicinal purposes. And he presents the fish to the Taisus Yamtiv, and lo and behold, the Satincus Marinus has scales, but no fins. So how do we deal with this? So this brings us, let's digress momentarily and discuss the following issue. Okay? A couple of years ago there was a big controversy. If the Gemara gives us scientific information, and yet, let's say about the orbit of the moon, or the size of the sun, or the size of the earth, or scientific information about biology, chemistry, astronomy, and based on the scientific information of our times, we see that the Gemara does not seem to be giving us accurate information. How do you deal with that? So, do we say, just like any halacha, the Gemara tells us, is obviously, we have a tradition dating back from Har Sinai. This is not Ravina, Rav Ashi, Rish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan telling us halacha. This is something that a tradition they received all the way back from Har Sinai. This is coming from Hashem himself, and that is our belief. Any halacha, any Torah in the Gemara, every Jew is obligated to believe that this is our oral tradition dating back from Har Sinai. Are we likewise required to believe that the scientific information given over in the Gemara, for instance, in the Gemara Sanhedrin, it talks about when the soul enters the embryo, when the gender of an embryo is determined, what is considered life-threatening? Are we obligated to accept scientific information that this is something that God gave over to Moshe Rabbeinu and it was passed down generation to generation? Or perhaps, just because the Gemara gives us Torah information, and that we believe and accept, perhaps the scientific information that the Gemara tells us was merely based on the scientific information that was known at the time. Maybe it was based on the Greek scholars or the Roman scholars, and this was the prevailing scientific information. And now perhaps that we have updated information, we could say, the Gemara never meant to teach us this, that we have to believe it be'emunah. This was the best knowledge they had available at the time. And now that we have more researched information, so we'll accept the information of our time. This is a very major issue, and it doesn't really have anything to do with the fish. And that is because the rule of the Mishnah Nida is not a scientific rule, it's a halachic rule. The Mishnah Nida is telling you, if you see a fish with scales, you could eat it, because it will definitely have fins. So this is a scientific piece of information which the Mishnah is saying you could rely on la halacha, which means this is definitely something that the Tanoim have a tradition from Har Sinai. But the question is, in general, it's important to know there are many Gemaras and Shas that provide us with scientific information. What is the source of that scientific information? Okay, this was a very big controversy in the last couple of years, and it's worthwhile to examine some of the sources and what our attitude should be. Yes?
Are you saying, I'm a little confused, are you saying that the dispute is that what was said then applies then, but since the Teva changed maybe...
No, so I'm not saying that. No,
I'm not saying that.
I'm saying maybe the scientific information of the times was based on the prevailing research and knowledge of those times. It wasn't necessarily a tradition they had from Har Sinai. The Gemara is giving you the best information that they had at that time. But now that we have perhaps more research or better ways of discovering scientific knowledge...
The Gemara is the best. The Gemara.
No, but perhaps... You're right. When it comes to halacha, it's the best because we have a tradition from Har Sinai. But maybe when it comes to the scientific information, the sources of the Amoram perhaps were from the scientific experts of their time.
One side says...
Let's see. Let's examine it. Okay.
But
let's see.
Mishana Teva doesn't apply.
I didn't say anything about Mishana Teva.
Not applying.
The Shita of Rabbi Avram ben Arambam, the Rambam's son, in his introduction, it's brought down in the Ein Yaakov, the son of the Rambam writes the following. Okay? And again, this is the first opinion. The son of the Rambam writes, He says, based on what I wrote earlier, look at number 6. We are not obligated, based on the superior capabilities of the sages of the Talmud, to accept that just because we're required to believe everything they tell us in areas of Torah, we are not necessarily likewise obligated to accept what they say in matters of refuah, in matters of teva, in matters of medicine. Just because we have to believe that when they tell us a halacha about what we're allowed to eat, what we're not allowed to eat, what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do, what we're allowed to look at, what we're not allowed to look at, that is certainly misinai. But if they tell us what is considered mortal danger, what is considered medical knowledge, we're not required to believe that, says Rabbi Avram, the son of the Rambam. Their information regarding science was not necessarily based on a Torah tradition. It was based on the prevailing knowledge of the time. This is the opinion of Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, certainly a very strong force to reckon with.
What year was he?
Remember the Rambam? He's one of the Rishonim, right? Okay.
But excuse me.
Yeah.
Can we accept some word from them and some of them not? Obviously not.
Look,
you have to believe them all the way, or you should.
No, again, when it comes, again, we're not talking about matters of halacha, anything in the Gemara. We accept the Emunah Shlema, and if we question even one letter of any halacha found in the Gemara, one has a status of an apikoros. Okay, but we're specifically talking about, let's say the Gemara says, the gender is determined at a certain date. And based on scientific research, we see either yes or no, maybe it's determined on a different date. Are we required to say, scientists, they have it wrong, we accept the words of the Gemara, or no? Maybe the Gemara is not imposing scientific information as part of the oral tradition. It's merely giving us the best available information. The opinion, we're just saying the opinion of Rabbi Avram ben Rambam is scientific information of the Gemara was based on the prevailing knowledge of the time. By the way, it's brought down in the Oitzer HaPoskim. This is the opinion of Rav Shrira Gaon. Rav Shrira Gaon also holds this one. This is also the opinion of Rav Shamshin Rafal Hirsch. Okay? All great Gedolei Yisrael. However, there is a large slew of Rishonim that vehemently disagrees with this approach. One of those is the Rivash. The Rivash says, if the Gemara tells you one thing, you could have all the scientists in the world telling you the opposite. You have to accept the words of the Gemara. It doesn't matter whether it's regarding halacha or whether it's regarding science. Now, we may not necessarily understand what the Gemara means to convey to us. It may be being conveyed in a cloak of secrecy, and maybe it's only being conveyed to those who are able to crack the code of the Gemara. But nevertheless, even when it comes to scientific information, says the Rivash, we'll take a look at number 7. Va'anachnu al chachameinu nismach. We will rely on our chachamim. Afilu yamru lanu al yamin shehu smail. Even if they say that the east is the west, and the west is the east, and we look with our instruments and we see not like that, doesn't matter. Shehem kiblu ha'emes uperushe ha'mitzvah ish mi piyish ad Moshe Rabbeinu. Whatever they tell us is a tradition dating back to Moshe. Look what he says. Lo namin el chachnei hayavanim. We don't trust the Greek scholars. V'hayishmaelim shaloi dibru rak misarasam. Their knowledge is based on reason, logic. V'al pi eizan nisayon. They conducted certain experiments. Okay, experiments are reliable, but they don't necessarily determine, maybe there's a certain variable in the experiment that brought about a certain result. And in other words, what the Rivash is saying is that, well, while logic is certainly something that is reasonable to follow, not when you know the truth is otherwise. And if the Gemara tells us certain scientific information, that is the absolute truth, and no experiment and no type of study, it may present us with a question how to understand the Gemara, but at the end of the day, as the Rivash seems to be saying, we follow the traditions given us in the Gemara, even regarding scientific information.
This is Rav Shamshin Rafal Hirsch too?
No, this is the opinion of the Rivash. Now, how do we paskin? So you say, what do you mean paskin? This is not a halachic machlokes. It's one thing you want to know, how should you light the Ner Chanukah? So you look in the Shulchan Aruch, Machlekes Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, we paskin 1, and then 2, and then 3. But this is a hashkafic machlekes, right? This is a question about Jewish thought. How do we view information, scientific information in the Gemara? Okay, so it's a machlekes. Rabbi Avram ben Aramam says the scientific information was based on prevailing knowledge. Others disagree. What is considered the mainstream view? Okay, and who are we to determine and say what the mainstream view is? So it's very interesting. There's a doctor in Eretz Yisrael who wrote a sefer called Nishmas Avram. Nishmas Avram, actually ArtScroll translated it, I think in maybe 3 or 5 volumes. And he was in constant correspondence with Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Now, if you look in the Gemara, especially Masechta Gittin, it talks about different illnesses. There are different ways of curing it with different herbs and different plants have different medicinal properties. And basically, we have a cherem kadmonim. There's a cherem. The Maril writes, we have a cherem. We do not rely on any of the medical advice in the Gemara for certain reasons. But says the Nishmas Avram, there are other reasons why we don't have to follow the medical advice, and that is because we have the opinion of Rabbi Avram ben Arambam and Rav Shira Gaon that scientific information in the Gemara was not Torah Misinai, is not an oral tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu. Scientific information in the Gemara was based on the prevailing attitudes. So this is another reason why we don't necessarily follow the medicinal advice in the Gemara. So he asked Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach for a haskama for his sefer. So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says, many of the reasons that you brought down are valid reasons why we don't follow medical advice in the Gemara. You're right. There is a cherem kadmonim. You're right. We don't necessarily understand what herbs the Gemara is referring to. But when you say that there's an opinion of Rabbi Avram ben Arambam and Rav Shira Gaon that the scientific information in the Gemara is not something that we have a tradition from Har Sinai, you cannot write this opinion as a mainstream opinion. This opinion is what we call a Yesh Oimrim, says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. It needs to be relegated to Yesh Oimrim. Now, what does Yesh Oimrim mean? Sometimes you look in the Shulchan Aruch, it brings down a halachic opinion, and then it says, Yesh Oimrim, there are those who say this and this and this. So what do we do if the Shulchan Aruch says, Yesh Oimrim to do this halacha? We don't follow it. Why don't we follow it? Because a Yesh Oimrim is merely a minority view. It's not the mainstream view. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, we are not one to argue with Rabbi Avram ben Arambam. Certainly no one is alive today to say that Rabbi Avram ben Arambam is incorrect. We're not capable of arguing with Rabbi Shira Gaon. Nevertheless, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach writes that this view, although it's authentic, right? We can't say it's not an authentic view. It's certainly an authentic view. Nevertheless, it's not considered a mainstream view. And so perhaps that would mean, in a yeshiva, what should they teach Talmidim in yeshiva? They should teach them that even the scientific information that is found in the Gemara, we have a tradition from Har Sinai. Now, those who are more mature, should they think this is the only view? No. There are authentic views, but these views are relegated to the position of Yeshem. That's the opinion of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Okay? I also saw quoted, there's a very interesting sefer called Leshem Shavai Va'achlama. Now, who's the lad? Written by the Baal HaLeshem. Who's the Baal HaLeshem? Rabbi Yashiv, right? He should be well. He should have Refuah Shalema. His Zayda was Rav Shlomo Elyashiv. Rav Shlomo Elyashiv is considered the last great master of Kabbalah. By the way, when he was recording, Leshem is after the name of a sefer, Leshem Shavai Va'achlama. He is considered the last one who had the authentic tradition of Kabbalah from the Vilna Gaon. By the way, when Rav Yashiv was a young man, below 20, the Baal HaLeshem would say over to Rav Yashiv his sefer, and Rav Yashiv recorded it. Okay. He writes the following. He writes, by the way, the Leshem is considered the Rebbe of the Chafetz Chaim in Kabbalah. Okay. In any event, look at number 9. He has what to say about this issue. And he says like this. V'ha'ikar. The main thing, ha'mechuyav l'chomi asher b'shem Yisrael yichuna. Anyone who considers themselves a Jew is required lahamin to believe. Be'emuna shleima, and complete faith. Shekoma shenimtza b'divrei razal. Anything found in the Gemara. Be'halachos. Whether it's halacha. Ve'agados, or I got it to B'Shas, Umidrashim. Heim kulam divrei Elokim chayim. These are all the words of the living God. Ki kol ma she'amru, because anything in Amorah said, beruach Hashem asher diber bam, was not just, he thought he woke up in the morning and this seemed reasonable to him. This is something that he's saying with divine inspiration. Umisayt Hashem lireyav. These are secrets that God transmits to those who fear Him. Just like the Gemara in Sanhedrin, where Rav Nachman makes a certain statement that has nothing to do with Gemara or Halacha. And the Gemara asks, where did Rav Nachman get this from? And the Gemara says, Said Hashem lireyav. This is something that God conveys to those who fear Him. So says the Baal HaLashem, it is the obligation of a believing Jew, not like Rabbi Avram ben Arambam, and not like Rav Shira Gain. And I've seen that perhaps the reason, once the Kabbalah became revealed to the world, the Zohar and the Kisvei Arizal became revealed to the world, so it became more understandable how even other aspects of the Gemara that are scientific may not have been necessarily said based on the prevailing attitudes of the times, but based on this hidden knowledge, we're able to derive all the secrets of the universe. Okay, so this is somewhat of a tangential point. Okay, about scientific information. Again, it's not something that is unanimously agreed upon, but certainly the Gedolim of our time, they feel that there's a certain mainstream view. Okay, back to the Satincus Marinus. Okay, so the Tosfos Yom Tov is sitting in his office, and Rabbi Avram Harofe brings in the Satincus Marinus. It has scales but no fins, and the Tosfos Yom Tov he doesn't know what to do with himself, because here's the problem. The problem is like this: if you're going to say that the Torah, the Mishnah says anything that has scales automatically have fins, and even though we don't see the fins on this Satincus Marinus, they must have fallen off or something, or we just don't know where they are. That's not acceptable to the Tosfos Yom Tov. You know why? Because the Satincus Marinus is a poisonous fish. Are you telling me that the Torah would allow and is giving us license to eat it? What? The Torah would allow us to eat a poisonous fish? We know the Gemara says in Masechta Sukkah that a certain type of plant is puzzled to be taken as a lulav because it has thorns in it. And God would never allow us to put ourselves in a situation of harm. So therefore we know a kafri, cannot be taken for a lulav because you're gonna sting yourself on the thorns. So certainly, to say that the Satincus Marinus, the fins fell off, and really God is going to allow us to eat it, why would God put us in a situation where somebody might eat a poisonous fish? And if you're going to say, we're not allowed to eat it because it really doesn't have fins, so this contradicts the rule of the Mishnah that any fish that has scales automatically has fins. So the Tosfos Yom Tov says, I don't know how to deal with this. Maybe you have to say that, it's a hybrid. This animal is some kind of cross that did not exist in the time of the Mishnah. In the times of the Mishnah, any fish that had scales automatically had fins. But this animal, they took, they took a fish and an alligator and they made a Satincus Marinus, whatever it's called, right? Mm-hmm. But that's the answer that the Tosfos Yom Tov says. But then he says, no, I feel there's a better answer. And that is if we examine carefully the difference between Pasuk Tes and Pasuk Yud. Take a look in number 1. Again, remember, the Torah seemed to reiterate the simanim of kosher fish in Pasuk Tes and then again in Pasuk Yud, with the notable difference that in Pasuk Yud, it adds that we're not just talking about Mikol Hashabayim, but Mikol Sheretz Hamayim or Mikol Nefesh HaChaya. Says the Tosfos Yom Tov, Pasuk Tes is talking about fish. Any fish that has scales will automatically have fins, and you will never discover a fish with scales and no fins. Pasuk Yud is not talking about fish. It's talking about Sheretz Hamayim. It's talking about Nefesh HaChaya. Right? It's talking about sea lions. It's talking about crocodiles. It's talking about frogs, toads, amphibians, lizards. And it's saying, if you want to be able to eat them, it has to have scales and fins. The Mishnah never said a rule regarding animals of the sea, that any animal of the sea that has scales will automatically have fins. The Mishnah gave a rule regarding fish, that anything that has scales will automatically have fins. The Mishnah's comment was directed at Pasuk Tes. Pasuk Tes is talking about fish. And the Mishnah is saying, even though the Torah says it has to have fins and scales, any fish that has scales will automatically have fins. The Mishnah never meant to comment that in Pasuk Yud, any animal of the sea that has scales will automatically have fins. The Mishnah was merely commenting on fish and not creatures of the sea.
Right.
Okay. Now the Pri Chadash, one of the classic commentaries on Shulchan Aruch.
Saying the Satincus Marinus is not a fish.
The Satincus Marinus happened to have 4 legs.
Right, sure.
So it had scales. It happened to have 4 legs. So this is not a fish. This is some kind of amphibian, some kind of creature of the sea. So when it comes to the creatures of the sea, the rule of the Mishnah that anything that has scales will have fins does not apply. Okay? That was the explanation of the Taisus Yom Tov.
Actually, they specified exactly fit for this way, for nobody is going to come and question.
Yeah.
They said, hey, this one, for example, I find it in the ocean, and it's an animal they want to eat.
Yeah, so that's how he's reading the Mishnah. In other words, he's limiting the Mishnah, he's qualifying the Mishnah. The Mishnah's rule that whatever has scales has fins is only specifically referring to the first pasuk Tes, fish. Animals of the sea, there's no such rule. Okay, so that's how we deal with Satincus Marinus. Okay? Comes along the Pri Chadash, and he rejects both answers of the Taisus Yom Tov. Answer number 1. What was the Taisus Yom Tov's first answer? The answer is, in the times of the Mishnah, there were no fish that had scales but no fins, but this is some kind of hybrid, right? The SUV hybrid? This is a hybrid, right? A cross between who knows what. Says the Pri Chadash, Chas v'shalom, say something like that. If the Mishnah gives a rule that any fish that has scales will have fins, it will last until the end of time. We have no right to say, the Mishnah was only giving a rule for the animals that existed at that time. The written law is eternal, the oral law is eternal. And if the Mishnah gives a rule, it has to be a rule that will stand the test of time, and that means even hybrids, even crossbreeded animals, you'll never find an animal that has scales and no fins. What about the second answer of the Taisus Yom Tov, that maybe this rule only applies to fish and not animals of the sea? Says the Pri Chadash, it's halachically incorrect. Halachically, there is no difference between fish and amphibians, even though in science we like to distinguish between different classes. Not in halacha. If the Mishnah says whatever has, it says kol, anything that has scales will have fins, that applies to fish, that applies to anything in the water. And we have no right to start qualifying and saying that it only applies to fish and not to animals of the sea.
Is he a Yesh Amrim?
The Pri Chadash?
Yeah, no.
I don't know. I don't have any contemporary poskim that weigh in on this one. But he says something very interesting. He says, the Taisus Yom Tov had a question. How could the Torah give us a rule? This is what the Pri Chadash says. You know what the Taisus Yom Tov should have answered? He should have told the guy, you don't see fins? But the Mishnah says whatever has scales has fins. So you know what happened? They fell off. And if they didn't fall off, they just didn't grow yet. But if the Mishnah gives a rule that whatever has scales has fins, even if you don't see the fins, you know what you should do? Take the fish out and eat it. But you don't, what do you mean? But it has to have scales and fins. No, it doesn't matter. The Mishnah says if it has scales, it has fins. But you'll say, but why would the Torah allow you to eat something that's poisonous? Says the Pri Chadash, arsenic is also kosher, right? It's not treif. Why did the Torah say, don't eat arsenic, don't drink Mr. Clean, right? Don't go home and drink rubbing alcohol. The Torah knows everything has its purpose, right? The Torah didn't have to put Isser on every plant that's poisonous. The fact that the Mishnah says anything that has scales has fins, the Torah is not trying to make you eat a Satincus Marinus. You'll know it's a poisonous fish. You won't eat it. And the reason why it's kosher is perhaps it has you could extract certain chemicals to make medicine, but just because it's kosher, just because it has scales, which automatically means it has fins, that doesn't mean the Torah is giving you something to eat that's harmful. Torah doesn't, just because something is kosher doesn't mean you have to eat it, right?
Yeah, poisonous parrot.
Right? Just because something has a hechsher on it, if it's not healthy, there's still no mitzvah to eat it. It just, right? A hechsher says you can eat it. Doesn't mean it's a mitzvah to eat. So the same, right? Okay. We still have not explained, though, right? We still have not explained the answer of the Gemara. Okay? Back to the Gemara, and this will conclude with this. The Gemara had a question. If anything that has scales has fins, why didn't the Torah just write scales, and I would automatically know fins? What was the Gemara's answer? Yagdil Torah v'yader. We want to make the Torah big. What's that supposed to mean? We want to make the Torah big.
Oh, we want to make.
So Magen Avraham wrote a sefer on Chumash. Actually, he wrote a commentary on the Yalkut Shemini. Okay, the Magen Avraham, right? Rabbi Avram Gambiner, right? One of the Noisei Kelim on Arachayim, the Magen Avraham. He wrote a sefer on Chumash called Zayis Ra'anan. And the Magen Avraham says the following. Magen Avraham says, if the Mishnah tells us a rule that whatever has scales will have fins, this is a halachic rule, which means if you see a fish that has scales, you could eat it, you don't have to check if it has fins. Says the Magen Avraham. But what about the fact that the Satincus Marinus has scales but no fins? Doesn't that contradict the rule? Says the Magen Avraham. This is the only exception. But this is not a real exception. You know why? Because the rule was given to man so that man could know what to eat. And if you see a fish with scales, you'll know you're allowed to eat it because you'll know it has fins. But no one is eating the Satincus Marinus anyway because it's poisonous. And therefore, it's not a contradiction to the rule because no one's going to eat it anyway. Okay, so then the question is, if whatever has scales has fins, why would the Torah write fins? Yagdil Torah v'yader. Says the Magen Avraham. Although we do not find anywhere in Shas that the Gemara ever answers Yagdil Torah v'yader, we find one instance in Shas where the phraseology, where the term Yagdil Torah v'yader is used. Rabbi Chananya ben Akashya Omer, Ratza HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Zakar Yisas Yisrael. God wanted to give the Jewish people merit. Lefikach Hirba Lohem Torah u'mitzvahs. Therefore, He gave us a lot of mitzvahs. Shenemar Hashem Chafetz L'man Sidkai. God wanted to make us righteous. Yagdil Torah v'yader. What does this mean, right? Anytime somebody wants to say a Kaddish, right? It's the answer to everything. You can always just invoke Rabbi Chananya ben Akash. What does it mean? Rasa Kadosh Baruch Hu L'Zakar Yisrael. Says Rashi. There are many things in this world we would not do anyway. Right? No one is going to eat a cockroach. No one is going to eat a rat. No one is going to, right? Nobody's going to do that. No one's going to walk down the street and see, a centipede and pick it up and eat it. Right? Mm-hmm. Almost nobody, right? No one. Mm-hmm. But Jews not going to do that. So why did Hashem have to tell us not to eat it? Don't eat the cockroach, right? Don't eat the rat. Don't eat the centipede. Because Hashem knows that even though we're not going to do it, He wanted to give us reward. He wanted to give us a mitzvah. We're not going to kill. But Hashem said, Loi tirtzach. Why? Because He wanted to give us reward for not killing. We're not going to steal. But Hashem wanted to give us reward. So He said, Loi tignov. Ratzah HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Zakar Yisrael. God wanted to give us merit. So what did He do? He added many, many mitzvahs that are not necessary and we would have done anyway just for the sake of giving us chak. Says the Magen Avraham. You're right. Anything that has scales has fins. And therefore it's really not necessary for the Torah to write fins, because if it has scales it will automatically have fins. But you know what? Hashem knows that there's going to be one exception to the rule. 3,000 years down the road, they're going to discover a fish called Satincus Marinus. And the Satincus Marinus will have scales, but no fins. Why are we not going to eat the Satincus Marinus? Well, if we would just rely on the rule of the Mishnah and Nida, why are we not going to eat the Satincus Marinus? Not because it's not kosher, because anything that has scales has fins. You know why we're not going to eat it? Because it's poisonous. So therefore, you know what the Torah said? Hashem said, I don't want you to refrain from eating the Satincus Marinus because it's poisonous. I want to give you a better reason not to eat the Satincus Marinus. You know why? Because it doesn't have fins. Right? So that's the answer of Yagdil Torah v'Yadir. In other words, if anything that has scales automatically has fins, so the question is, so let the Torah just say scales, no need to mention fins. You know what the answer is? Because down the road, you're going to discover one fish that has scales and no fins, and now the only reason you're not going to eat it is why? Because it's poisonous. But Hashem says, no. I wrote an extra word in the Torah for the purpose of what? Yagdil Torah v'Yadir. I wanted to make not the Torah bigger. I wanted to give you more mitzvos. I wanted to give you the opportunity to refrain from doing an Aveira, not because if you eat the Satincus Marinus, that will be the end of you, right? You'll be 3 feet under. I wanted to give you, I wrote snap here in the Torah to give you a mitzvah that there'll be one fish that otherwise you wouldn't have eaten anyway because it's poisonous. I'm going to give you the siman of fish. Why? To be able to have one more mitzvah in the Torah. Says the Magen Avraham, that's what the Gemara means, Yagdil Torah v'Yadir. The question is, it's an extra siman, because we ain't eating this, we're not eating a fish anyway, because either it's poisonous or it's not kosher. The answer is, for the poisonous fish, Hashem wanted to give us a mitzvah reason not to eat it. Okay? And we'll just end with one last point. When it comes to kosher food, not kosher food, right? Rashi tells us at the end of Parshas Kedoshim, when you're passing by a McDonald's, right? What are you supposed to say? You're supposed to say, I hate the smell of ham and cheese. I don't like lobster, it's disgusting. No, Rashi says, you shouldn't say, right? Efshi bechazer, efshi beklayim. Right? You should say, efshi, I like it. I love the way it smells. I love the way seafood smells. But, in other words, when it comes to refraining from doing averos, a person shouldn't say, I wouldn't eat treif anyway. Who likes it? It's disgusting, right? It has, chazer. You can get trichinosis or something. I'm not going to eat seafood. I'm going to get a stomachache. No, says Rashi, you're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to specifically think that the reason why you're refraining from the Avera is because Hashem said so, not because you don't want to do it. Right? That's Lahagdil Torah Ladir. In other words, Hashem wanted to give us the opportunities to do mitzvahs, and Hashem says, I'm going to tell you not to do something you wouldn't do anyway, and now it's your job to think when you're refraining that the reason you're refraining is out of honor to Hashem. However, does this apply by all Averos? Should a person say, yeah, I would love to, I would love to kill someone. Yeah, but what could I do? Hashem told me not to, right? I would love to punch the guy out, but what could I do? Hashem told me not to do, right? I would love to take revenge against it. I would love to pickpocket the guy over there, but what can I do? Torah said not to. Who asked so the Rambam in the Shemini Prakim asks, this rule doesn't necessarily always seem to be so logical. When do we say, I would love to eat lobster, but Hashem told me not to do it. I would love to wear shatnez, right? Shatnez feels really good. I like the way I like the way it feels on my neck, but Hashem told me not to do. Which averos are you supposed to say you would like to do, and which averos are you supposed to say, even had the Torah not given them, I would not like to do them? What? So the Rambam sets forth the following rule. The Rambam writes in Parak Vav of Shemini Prakim, this is not an absolute rule. When it comes to mitzvos that are logical, don't kill, don't steal, don't speak lashon hara, don't slander, don't harm your friend, then a person should not say, I would love to knock that guy out, but what can I do? The Torah says not to know. Your person shouldn't say that. A person should develop the feeling that whatever the Torah says, this is something that they would like to feel naturally. That's when it comes to what we call mitzvos sichlios. The rule of Yagdil Torah v'Yadir that we're saying only applies by those mitzvos that are not necessarily something we would come to through our own reason, right? A person would not necessarily think, if they never heard of a Torah, they would not necessarily say, shatnez, who would wear shatnez, right? No, who would ever think of not wearing shatnez? Who would think of not eating pig? Who would think of not eating seafood? So when it comes to chukim, that's when we say a person should think, had Hashem not told this to me, I would do it. I would like to do it. But what can I do? This is the decree of Hashem. When it comes to something that's logical, however, a person shouldn't say, I would love to do it. For that we say, whatever the Torah tells us, this is something you should try to develop a natural feeling for.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.